Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this episode, I'm tackling one of the biggest crises facing all of us. No, not COVID, but the climate. In a year when we've seen extreme weather conditions, there is obvious evidence that our planet is changing. The biggest driver of that is human behaviour. So I wanted to speak to someone who is trying to influence that behaviour. If COVID was the world's largest ever compliance project, the environment is the world's largest ever behavioural change project. And it's about as human risk relevant as it gets. My guest on this episode is Roc Sandford. He's a member of a group called Extinction Rebellion. They're a global environmental movement founded in the UK and who describe their rationale for existing as follows. Life on Earth is in crisis. Our climate is changing faster than scientists predicted, and the stakes are high. Biodiversity loss, crop failure, social and ecological collapse, mass extinction. We are running out of time, and our governments have failed to act. We have a moral duty to take action, whatever our politics. Now, listeners in the UK will be aware of and maybe even have been impacted by Extinction Rebellion protests in London and other cities. The group took over iconic locations, stopped traffic, and generated huge amounts of publicity with a mixture of positive and negative reactions. I wanted to understand more about why they're going about things in this way. What's the logic behind the methods they're deploying? To win over those who aren't part of Extinction Rebellion requires a delicate balancing act between generating awareness and persuading people that change is necessary. Equally, how are they thinking about mitigating human risk within their own organisation? So I was delighted when Roc agreed to come onto the show. He's thoughtful, engaging, and infectiously passionate about what he's trying to achieve. And far from preaching or lecturing others, he's looking to engage people. There are also some fascinating lessons for all of us from the way Extinction Rebellion is going about achieving its mission. You might not think of environmental groups as experts in governance processes and running online meetings, but they've got some really innovative ideas for how to do that I think are worth exploring in a corporate environment. After all, we've all been to really badly run meetings, so hearing about different ways of running them is probably no bad thing. The other reason I wanted Roc on the show is that he's looking for ideas, and I want to help highlight that every single one of us can not only help by thinking about the choices we make, but also with ideas. And as many of you are in the business of influencing human decision-making, whether you work in behavioural science or maybe compliance or ethics, perhaps you've got some ideas that can help. If you do, then please share them with me and I'll pass them on to Roc. Stand by for some thought-provoking ideas on the biggest challenge facing our species, climate change. Roc, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. It's great to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. Look, and I know who you are and about you, but many of my listeners won't. Can you give us a sort of pen portrait of who you are and how you came to be doing what you're doing?
Well, how long have you got?
As long as you need.
To summarize a little, my academic background was quantitative. I was very interested in modeling geophysical and human systems and basically making a mathematical picture of how they worked so you could figure out if they needed to change, what you needed to do. And that's very much informed the rest of my life, actually. And on top of that, 30 years ago, I was lucky enough to be able to buy a deserted island in the Atlantic, off the Atlantic coast of Scotland, and figure out how to live without carbon. And I started living with carbon in that I had a Land Rover and I had a quad bike and I had a generator. And I had real headache ferrying in diesel for the generator, etc. And the Land Rover would always break down and I'd always be trying to fix it. And gradually I failed to fix these things and ended up having to do without. And that taught me that there is a sort of guzzling off-grid and a frugal off-grid. And I was moving from the guzzling to the frugal. And the frugal is nicer. That's the sort of secret at the end of the quest. It is actually wonderful. I can really recommend it. So that's my off-grid self, and I can sort of understand the changes our society needs to make from the inside. And then finally, I've spent many years as an environmental campaigner, and quite successful on occasion. And one of my focuses was salmon farming. And salmon farming is extremely damaging. I call it an environmental tragedy, because what happens is you put lots of salmon in cages. They have lots of diseases and parasites which infect the wild salmon swimming by, so they become extinct. And meanwhile, you have to shoot the seals that approach, and you have to put in things like smoke alarms under the water, which harm the hearing of whales and dolphins and porpoises, which is illegal, incidentally, and many other reasons. There's lots of evidence that because of the sort of food chain concentration of toxins in salmon meat, it's not good to eat as well. And one researcher very, very tellingly said, these compounds stay in your body, they've got a half-life of 75 years, and there's one way to get them out. And that way is to have a baby, because they go out in the breast milk and the placenta, through the placenta. So that's what one's up against. And while to begin with I was being quite successful, I became ever less successful, because the salmon industry was capturing the various regulatory bodies like the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, Scottish Environment Ministry, Marine Scotland, and basically getting them to basically enact the salmon farm industry's agenda. So I took a step back and thought, I have to take a natural science view of this and see what's worked in the past when something's going wrong and it needs to be changed. And I came very quickly to nonviolent direct action, which had worked beautifully with Martin Luther King's work and with Gandhi's work and with the suffragettes' work. Has to be nonviolent, both out of expedience, out of principle. And so I was sort of nosing around in that area, trying to see who'd done work in that. I tried to get the American Association for the Advancement of Science they invited me to give a talk, and I proposed this, that this was the way, and they withdrew the invitation, interestingly. It was someone who worked for them. It wasn't actually them formally. And I was looking on Twitter. I couldn't sleep one night. I was looking on Twitter, early 2018, and I saw that someone called Roger Hallam had put on Twitter, I'm going to sit down in front of the traffic at Marble Arch in London. Anyone feel like joining me? And that seemed to me like the thing to do. So I got on my bicycle. I happened to be in London, about 3 or 4 miles away. Bicycled over there, sat down in front of the traffic with him. I found it, and there were about 15 people there. I found it very, very unpleasant experience. It was, I think that the motorists didn't understand what it was, and therefore they weren't reacting in the way they react much more now, which is much more knowing what the deal is. So then there was a certain amount of fury, and I was sitting on the ground, someone came and kicked me in the face, and I went over backwards and got concussion, and so on. Now, that's a long story. But that moment, I knew I was in the right place, basically. I knew that I'd found the real interface with the problem, and that all the other stuff you do is not the real interface, and the energy gets absorbed without the problem being addressed. And so since then, I've been involved in what became Extinction Rebellion. In October that year, we formally declared rebellion in Parliament Square against the British government on grounds that they weren't doing what it would take to address the climate and nature emergencies. And we've had a series of protests since then with Extinction Rebellion. We've taken over 5 bridges on one occasion, very beautiful event. We've taken over 5 iconic landmarks within London, like Piccadilly Circus, Oxford Circus, and held them often for 1 or 2 weeks against all the efforts of the authorities to get us out. And it's gone on like that. In October, we held Trafalgar Square for, can't remember how long, maybe 10 days. And it's really a project of shaking up the British government so it really wakes up and stops posturing, which it's doing at the moment, and starts acting.
If I sort of, look at what you're trying to achieve, your primary piece here is clearly generating awareness, because there's something every single person can do to contribute towards this. But your real target here is government and getting them to make changes.
I think speaking of Extinction Rebellion, because I have an existence outside Extinction Rebellion, but Extinction Rebellion has 3 demands. And the 3 demands are tell the truth, tell people what they're facing, what's coming, because that's not happening. And it's happening to a much greater extent than it was when we started 2 years ago. And there have been lots of other people working on this too. But there's some very wonderful data that I've seen that I actually don't have in my possession. But I gave a talk and someone had a slide, which I loved, which showed Google searches for things like climate breakdown and the way they corresponded with Extinction Rebellion protests. So it's working in raising consciousness, in moving the Overton window, which is the window of what is sort of validly accepted into public discourse. And it's moved the government to posture, as I say, on climate, which is first step. And that's the first demand, to tell the truth. The second demand Extinction Rebellion makes is it looks at, say, the Paris Agreement and the IPCC and what is being said about the changes needed to not breach the 1.5 degree temperature rise threshold. And it has sort of done a shortcut for that because it's quite complex and said that means decarbonising the UK by 2025. And unfortunately, that's a really tight timescale. But unfortunately, that's what the science is pointing at if we don't want to go through 1.5 degrees. And if we do go through 1.5 degrees, it doesn't look pretty. You know, we lose a huge amount and we may get into the positive feedback loops where it's unstoppable. So second demand, decarbonise by 2025. And the third demand is about governance. It's about observing that the UK government has not succeeded in getting to grips with this problem because of its institutional difficulties. The fact that it's in bed with a lot of fossil fuel companies, etc. You know, it's got very well documented problems, party funding, lobbying, etc. And so the proposal is to have a citizens' assembly, so-called, which is perhaps 1,000 people chosen at random to represent the UK population and to take the really difficult decisions which politicians are ducking. And then the politicians can have cover and they can actually enact those decisions.
And that's interesting because I think one of the challenges, as you've rightly identified in that structure, is clearly for this to happen, there are some pretty big steps out there, some real shift changes. So small things are no longer, you know, it's important people do small things, but the small things aren't going to make use those big pieces you need. And you've rightly identified one of the interesting challenges here is that it sort of requires people to stop doing what they're doing now and have been doing for some time and to rethink those. And that, we know that politicians don't like to be seen to be inconsistent. So I think that's a really interesting idea that sort of says, we recognize the personal challenge this will pose to you and implicitly the unlikelihood, if that's a word, of you being able to do that. So park that and we'll just get some other people in and almost you can hand over responsibility and I guess blame them. So you don't have to worry too much about the personal conniptions that you might have to go through. Is that the sort of thinking? Yeah, I think the thinking, it may be, I think it's not being done for the benefit of the politicians, but to drive change. But a byproduct to sell it to the politicians is that actually this way you can duck out of the unpopular decisions because a lot of the things that have to happen will be unpopular. And it's just a question of helping people understand that what they're choosing between is their children's safety and carrying on with the sort of comfortable life. Not everyone's got a comfortable life, but some people have, and that's causing trouble. So that's a choice. It's not a choice to carry on with the fossil fuel guzzling unless you're willing to sacrifice your children. And I read somewhere you made a fascinating comparison between COVID and the climate emergency, where basically COVID it's almost a sort of in many respects polar opposites, where you've got COVID impact the older generations much more, and it's the younger ones who feel. And then you can flip it around the other way around for the climate emergency. I think I wouldn't mind exploring that a little bit and sort of your thoughts on that. Well, COVID is clearly a tragedy, and many people have lost their lives. Many people have lost their jobs. Many more are going to lose their jobs. It's a complete tragedy. And it's a tragedy in particular for the young, because they're not able, for young people in particular, they need to meet their future partners and develop themselves as social beings. And they've been thwarted in this by lockdown and things like that, for good reason. COVID is also, incidentally, in my view, a special case of what the problem is, which is, it's a technical term from economics, but it's negative economic externalities, and it's an off-putting term. But what it means is when you're doing something which is harming other people, and you're not picking up the tab, that's a negative externality. It's a cost you're imposing on other people
for something which you're choosing to do. And an example might be, say, a negative externality of flying into Wuhan in China and coming back infected with the virus is that you've then spread it, all over. And you pay the cost of getting ill, but society pays the cost of all the deaths and all the economic mayhem. And climate and nature breakdown are also externalities. So they're driven by, say, the oil industry pumping oil, greenhouse gases going up into the atmosphere, that heating the planet, that causing drought, that causing famine, etc., destabilizing populations. And that's an externality. If the oil industry had to pay the cost of that, they'd be out of business tomorrow and renewables would be flourishing. So that's what's going on. And I think the point I made that you're alluding to was, with the COVID, we've seen what governments are willing to do to protect the old. And they're going to immense lengths to protect the old. It would have been unthinkable like a year ago that they would do this. But they've sort of slammed the brakes on the whole economy, basically. And yet they're doing nothing to protect the young. They're posturing, but they're not actually acting to the degree that they need to act to actually solve the problem.
What you're up against is a combination of factors. So there are clearly vested interests in preventing the change that you're looking to progress. There are also human biases around it. We've got the sort of extreme fringe who pretend nothing's going on. So we'll park those because I think they're arguably lost cause. And I think if everybody else was with the program, wouldn't be a problem. But for the average person who sort of looks at this, you're basically up against a challenge here in the way that we think about things, which is that we focus on the here and now. And so we know this, one of our cognitive biases is we're not very good at looking far ahead. We're predisposed to worry about today rather than thinking about tomorrow. Hence, it's difficult to get people to save for pensions, dieting, all these sorts of things that have impacts tomorrow. It's very difficult because we're going against the grain of human thinking in what we're asking people to do here.
It is very difficult. And we've got perceptive bias, which we've evolved with to survive in environments which are very different to the one we're facing. So there's all sorts of things like solve the problem that's right in front of you, don't worry about what's coming, that has been very good sort of evolutionary. It's been evolutionary very sensible. It's not now. We've run out of road on that way of behaving. I suppose the sort of positive side of it all is that we do know a lot about, we have really good behavioral science. We know a lot about what gets people to behave in certain ways. And I think you're right in kind of hinting that we maybe haven't used the lessons of that to the extent we could do. And there's many, many areas. There's social proof. There's all sorts of biases to do with self-interest and so on.
Many people that have criticised the movement have looked and said, you're being disruptive, you're telling us what to do, I just want to live my life. So even if I accept that the environment, I clearly things going on around us, we're seeing more extreme weather than we've ever seen before. So there's clearly something going on, but you can sort of sit there and say, how dare you tell me what to do? I'm just trying to go about living my life. It's tough enough anyway. And your tactics of disruption are making my life even more difficult. So if I'm a cab driver, for example, you're blocking the roads, I can't earn money, it's difficult enough anyway. How do you respond to that argument that your tactics are unhelpful in the sense that it feels like you're either you could be argued that you were preaching, you're being destroyed, you're being a pain and a nuisance, and you're not working with people, you're just getting in their way?
We are fighting for our lives and our children's lives. And I think that anyone who, in good faith, looks at the science, really with an open mind, they'll see that that's what we're doing and that we're not making this up. It's happening. So I think what I'd say is, me personally, I don't want to be there. I don't want to be sitting in front of the traffic. I've got lots of stuff to do. I'm really busy. I've got lots of stuff I want to do with myself. But I don't have an option. Government's been captured by vested interests. There's lots of vested interests. You mentioned cabs, but the black cab lobby has captured Transport for London in terms of obstructing the transition to low carbon transport, etc. There are so many vested interests which are really professional about obstructing the policy changes that are needed. And perhaps all we can do what we have to do is what works, basically. And I suppose what we're being challenged for is that it is working. People don't mind us doing what doesn't work. They're happy with that.
Right. So put in simple terms, the ends justify the means.
Yes. I don't think there are any other means. If there were other means, we would use them. But I would qualify that by saying that I think there's a smart way to do it. And the smart way to do it, I'm afraid one has to be disruptive to get noticed. Otherwise, you're ignored and nothing happens. And you feel good. You feel like you've done your bit, but you haven't actually changed anything. And it's a species of denial. It's the sort of, perhaps one of the most dangerous aspects of environmental action is that you imagine by signing a petition, you've done your bit. So it has to be disruptive. And that's unfortunate because it disrupts ordinary people who are just trying to get on with their lives and survive in this really difficult world. But there's no option. And then where I would sort of qualify it is I would say it has to disrupt the problem, not the solution. So ideally, you should be disrupting, say, I don't want to get myself in hot water, but you should be disrupting the big sources of emission, not the don't disrupt the bicycle lane, disrupt the private jet. And I'd also say there are other lessons to learn about how to do this effectively. One is that you need to make it beautiful and you need to make it iconic. And I have another hat, which is Ocean Rebellion, which is basically trying to save the oceans. And we make a big thing about just making these protests, which just can't be ignored because they're so beautiful. They become iconic images. And I think you have to address whatever you're disrupting in its own language so it understands, and you're asking it for things that it can do within its powers. So if it's the Bank of England, you have to understand the Bank of England's powers. You have to understand how they're contributing to this problem by bailing out sunset industries like the airlines and by stimulus packages which are not, basically are going into buying bonds in fossil fuel companies, etc., and financing them. So you've got to have technical ask. You've got to understand their business as well as they do, or better. And actually, we do find that because we're not siloed, we do really understand often. It sounds sort of arrogant, but there's real value added when we talk to the people who have their hands on levers of power, in that we're outside the box and we can say, well, have you thought of this? And they haven't often. So you're addressing the stakeholder, basically, who has the, who in your analysis has the power to change things. You're also addressing the public with these iconic images, so they understand in sort of more straightforward terms your narrative. And you're also addressing people who may want to join you, who understand their children's lives are at stake, who understand their own values and that that's not acceptable, and they may want to join you. So you need them to understand how they can bring their own particular abilities into the equation.
And I guess one of the risks that you face is it's a large movement, so you'll have a range of different views about other issues that will come in naturally, so a range of different political views. And there is a little bit of a danger here, isn't there, of preaching to the choir, in that there will be people who might not take, if I take a sort of classic environmentalist hippie image, there'll be people that are not attracted to that, and we'll sort of think back to people listeners in the UK will remember Swampy as an example of an environmental activist. That's a sort of stereotypical image that people have. And for some people, that's terribly attractive, and for some people, that's off-putting. It's quite challenging in a way, isn't it, to present a united front that can go beyond that can capture the hearts and minds of people that might not be particularly attracted by that end of the spectrum, or other political elements that may come in.
Yes, I think you're right. And I think this is a non-party political issue, and it mustn't be allowed to become one, because this affects everyone. This affects people who believe in free markets, people who believe in collectivism, etc. It is really something that everyone has got to face and get to grips with. And so the question of how you appeal to different people, I think there's very interesting work done on the message that different demographic groups will understand and will accept. And for the more conservative with a small c side of the population, I think there's a lot around duty, around responsibility, around what sort of legacy you want to leave to the next generation. those are all conservative concepts and values. And I think we have to be stressing those just as much as we're stressing the more kind of so-called progressive side of the equation to that demographic or market.
And it's fascinating you talk, because I was sort of struck with, if you take Germany as an example, where the Green Party, much greater influence and clearly has indeed formed part of the government there. That's clearly identified with the left and a very left-wing agenda, and so you would be unlikely to find right-leaning people who would be thinking it was a good idea to vote for them because of the other things that came with it. And I'm really struck by your recognition of that, because I think one of the things that may surprise many listeners is the way you're articulating it. I think the visuals often that you get from the protests and the way often look like it's playing to that stereotype. And actually, what you've just articulated is very much more of a consensual working with and looking for the arguments that will land with the different audiences. And that, I think, is quite surprising to people, which may be part of the challenge here.
Well, you spoke earlier about behavioral science. And I think one of the very interesting findings of behavioral science is that if you've got an other, it's an incredibly unifying force. And the breakdown of the climate, breakdown of nature, and the potential breakdown of society is the most almighty other that we've ever seen, basically. So if that can't unify people with different political beliefs, what can? And one of the projects, I've worn various hats within Extinction Rebellion over the last few years, but one of them came from the perception that peaceful protest, non-violent direct action, was being incredibly successful. And to give you an example, I think Parliament declared a climate emergency within a few weeks of one of our protests, having been completely uninterested just before. There was a debate just before about climate. From memory, I think it was February 2019 in the House of Commons. And in the photographs, you could see hardly anyone was there. It was like a joke. Then we had our rebellion in April, and then they had basically Parliament declared a climate emergency shortly after. So it works. And I think it's a necessary condition of achieving what we have to achieve. And unfortunately, there's lots of necessary conditions. We need lots of different tools. But it struck me that what we were missing, and not just me, but various other people, was dialogue with the people who actually had their hands on the levers of power. And these people are real people. They sometimes don't understand the science, because they buy the mass media picture that everything's okay if we decarbonize by 2050. It's not, unfortunately. It's really sad, but it's not. And so they don't understand the science. They've got often good faith policies, like to be carbon zero in their emissions by 2050 or whatever. But again, those policies aren't going to actually succeed. And they're human beings, often with families, with children, with values. And so we engage with them in dialogue, and we bring them into a space where they understand the science, they understand the inadequacy of their policies, and they understand that they have children they need to protect. And that's extremely effective. And we talk in confidence and respectfully to people with immense power, household names in our economic system. Just bringing them into an understanding of really what's happening, bringing them out of denial.
You've talked a lot there about future generations, and that clearly is a very, very strong intrinsic argument. So if you have kids, you should by all rights want to secure their future. And that's what we are built to do as a species. So that's a very powerful argument. What other levers are you pulling, or buttons are you pressing with people around that? Because I can see that, somebody that has, for people that have kids, that works very well, I would imagine. But for other people who might not, or who may have other influences on them, are there other things that you're looking to address to sort of get through to them?
Well, firstly, children already dying, obviously. So it's not our kids yet, but it's other people's kids. And the kids one is very emotive because it's like I call it the strongest force in the world, which is the love of a parent for a child. And what's happening doesn't make sense given that strong force. So we've got everything on our side in stopping this just by activating that force. But in answer to your question about what else, what are the other levers? I think there's lots of levers, and they depend very much on who you're talking to. So there is a sort of moral lever. It's like, are you really just a materialistic person, or do you have moral values that maybe you want to look at and see whether you're living up to them? There's the enlightened self-interest one, which is not only is it's like once you start to unplug, it actually is often nicer. And to give you an example, about 15 years ago, I decided not to go on any more aeroplanes. Didn't make a vow. I didn't say I'm never going to go on an aeroplane again, but I decided not to. And it's kind of simplified my life. And I realized actually it's really horrible going on an aeroplane. It's just horrible. You have to queue up for hours. You think you're going to miss it. You lose your luggage. You get stuck where you're going. Turns out you don't like it, etc. So it's a great relief. So there's that one. It's a kind of social proof one, saying, look, I'm trying this, and actually it's really nice. You could try it too. And so on. I think there's many levers. It's quite intuitive. In a sense, the best way to find out would be for us to have a little session where I was trying to kind of bring you out of denial to the extent you're in it, and see what came up.
And I love that, because I think you hit the nail on the head of the way this is going to work, because it's that intrinsic motivation that you really need to pull out of people. I was struck by as you were talking, saying, I made a pledge not to get on a plane again. And as you were talking about it, I completely agree. I mean, it's a thoroughly unpleasant experience. And of course, there's a reason we get jet lag, which is we're not programmed to be able to travel that quickly, as an example. And so it's an unnatural thing to sit in a metal tube for hours on end with, and go through all those processes. And I liked the way you were just sort of talking about it in very, very human, realistic terms, and saying we need to get back to the core of what we're at. And I'm really struck that when we try and get people to, and whether we're looking at something like slavery or equality or any of these sort of topics that we naturally know we ought to be doing, it's fascinating when one thinks about, actually, if you can activate the human arguments, the things that we all intuitively we know that trashing the environment is not a good thing. It doesn't feel good, doesn't smell good, it rails against us. And yet we've built these structures and I'm really struck by the fact that you could, it's a similar emotional argument to many of the other things that we're trying to change about society and getting people to behave that. And I'm fascinated by sort of thinking about what one can learn from other movements, what we've seen succeed. And the way you were talking initially around your principles seemed to me you had learned from, there were elements of the suffragette movement that came through. There were lots of things where you seem to have you're thinking very smartly around the human dynamics of this challenge.
Fairly smartly, but I think there's a lot further to go. So I think you're right. It's all about incentives. It's how to incentivize the people who need to make the changes. And social psychology and various things tell us a lot about that. And I think I mentioned the demands of Extinction Rebellion. Let me tell you a little bit more about how it's structured, because I think it's quite interesting. And I think there are lessons for all sorts of bodies from this. But basically, it's got its 3 demands, which are its mission, is what it's trying to achieve. It's also got 10 principles, which are its constraints on means of how it can validly achieve those. And the principles are things like non-violence. It has to be non-violent. The moment any violence enters into the picture, it is not Extinction Rebellion. But there's another one I really like, possibly my favorite, which is that you don't blame or shame any individual. It's not about individuals, and we're all stuck in this toxic system, which is driving our behavior in ways which doesn't align with our values, and sort of, we're trapped. So I think those principles are very important part of the success. And given that you're trying to achieve those 3 demands and you're obeying those 10 principles, then you are Extinction Rebellion, and you're relatively autonomous. You should talk to a few people to see if you've gone mad. But basically, if you think in good faith that you're going to be able to achieve something by doing something, whether it's picketing Barclays or sitting in the road or whatever, then you must go ahead and do that.
And so you've got the what you're trying to achieve, and then there's the parameters of how you can go about doing that. And then within that, you're basically empowering people effectively to go and undertake missions, if you like, within those constraints. I mean, that's very interesting, because on the one hand, you'd say that's a great way to channel human creativity, getting people to think find the thing that you think is going to be helpful to this, that you're motivated to go do, and providing you stick within our sort of framework. That's a very, on the one hand, very smart way of doing things, because you can really engage activists. On the other hand, there's quite a risk associated with that, because people are creative and they will find ways. And when I look at sort of sets of, it's very difficult to codify ethical principles, because if you overly codify so how do you think about the risk of sort of people going too far? And how do you manage that and think about risk management from that?
Well, it's a really good point. And it's very central to the extent to which Extinction Rebellion will be an enduring phenomenon or a brief phenomenon which will have done its job, but then be replaced by something else. And I think either outcome is fine, incidentally. What's important is not these individual movements, it's the achieving of the aim, which is ending the breakdown of the climate, ending the breakdown of nature. So I think the autonomy that we're talking about and the empowerment is basically giving people agency in a world where they didn't have agency before. So loads of people are concerned about what's happening to the climate and nature, but they just don't see what they can do. And here is something they can do, which we know works. Nonviolent direct action works. And it gave us civil rights in America. It gave us votes for women. It works. So that's fantastic. And so I suppose the problem is, the problem is if someone gets over enthusiastic and does something unwise, which maybe they're justified in doing, but maybe isn't smart, because it maybe gives ammunition to the vested interests who are trying to discredit us or whatever. How do you grapple with that? And I think so far to mention also, I think there's an agent provocateur problem as well, potentially. Mm-hmm. And there is an entryism problem of other groups who don't share the nonviolent values, trying to exploit the success of Extinction Rebellion. It has been extremely successful, and hijack it. So there are problems. And I think so far it's been extremely clear that the sort of benefits of that autonomy have been much greater than the costs. And there have been costs, and there have definitely been moments when someone's been proposing to do something within the movement. A good example was the Heathrow pause, where the proposal in protest against the third runway, which is a completely stupid and unnecessary thing to build, so completely just to protest. It's not needed. It is not Paris compliant. But the question is, how do you sort of get in there and protest? And some people completely validly wanted to take drones into the exclusion zone around Heathrow. One of them I spoke to said he took a toy drone in its box, unwrapped, it wasn't unwrapped, and he didn't have batteries, and he didn't have a mobile telephone that you needed to control it. So it was completely symbolic. But he took that into the exclusion zone around Heathrow, which is 2 or 3 miles around Heathrow, and he was arrested and locked up for several weeks. That's fine, that's all part of it. I think what happened within the movement is a lot of people felt that even if just, it was not expedient to do that. So within the movement, there was a lot of debate, and a lot of people saying, no, this is not the right approach. And I think that highlights your question, which is, it's a very flat movement. There's not a hierarchy. I think what you're in a way asking is, can something without a hierarchy survive with this degree of autonomy?
Right.
And I think, yes. Yeah. I think it's interesting. Time will tell. But I do think, having seen it myself, and also having introduced the methods we use, for instance, the meeting methods, to people, very senior people in sort of the private sector, government sector, we regularly get people saying, I've never seen anything like this. I've never been to a meeting like this. And what I call it holocratic subversion. So holocracy is this idea that you all have an equal share of voice. If there's a meeting with lots of people there, you don't get the most dominant person sort of taking over, deciding what the agenda is, etc. You have a standard way of having meetings, which is you check in at the beginning, you say how you're feeling, what you need to be present, which brings you into the sort of emotional space where you're actually feeling things instead of just the cerebral space. You then name the purpose of the meeting. Why are you meeting? And you then build the agenda all together. So anyone who wants to put something on the agenda will say it. And it's a sort of joint enterprise to prioritize what is on the agenda for this meeting. And someone facilitates. So someone, ideally without an axe to grind within what's being decided, is the person who looks out for people giving hand signals they want to speak, lets them speak in order, asks them to wind up if they're talking too long, and takes what's called temperature checks, where everyone can make a hand signal. It's basically jazz hands to say they agree with the proposal. It's a very, very efficient way of running meetings, and it brings out much better decisions. And so you're reducing risk even in that way.
And having participated, I thought it was fascinating because I think one of the reasons that corporates do silly things is some of the structures that are there, the decision-making structure, the all-powerful leaders, the meetings that are just Groundhog Day repeats of the previous meeting, where the first thing you do is read the minutes of the last one, thereby setting up this one to be just as appalling as the previous. So we shouldn't be surprised that we get... And I thought it was fascinating that you were being disruptive, not disruptive in a negative, but disruptive to traditional thinking and how you looked at your decision-making processes. And there were so many things that I just thought were really interesting. And part of me, as I observed these things, part of me was going, but this won't work because, and I found myself checking, just to think, well, actually, why wouldn't it? And I love that. And I think there's a lot from what you're doing that, climate aside, has some really interesting implications for how we think about things. And I loved the fact that it was just challenging some of those other orthodoxies, which I think in part have led to the problem that you're trying to solve.
That's why I call it subversion, because I think if you use our methods, our non-hierarchical methods, because what happens often is you'll get someone in charge who progressively is surrounded by yes people. And you see it with prime ministers, for instance, as their time goes on. Fortunately, Trump didn't get a chance to have a second term, but and he was probably already surrounded by yes people. But people lose touch with reality. That they go off in their own sort of model of reality, which isn't the real reality, once they get too much power. And this meeting structure means that no one has control of the meeting. And that's just much, much more fruitful in terms of good decision making.
And it also struck me that if you look at political leaders as an example, that a lot of weight is placed on what they do and how they behave. And so if you get a political leader that does something silly, just a small human thing, actually that can taint. So on the one hand, if you have a brilliant, charismatic leader, that can work fantastically well, but there's a flip side to that. And I think it's really interesting when you remove that, because you then get away from that sense of they ought to be saintly. And we've seen what happens when we have politicians who try and walk around with a saintly halo. At some point, the veneer comes up. We recognize they're human beings. And I think there's something fascinating about, we talk a lot about leadership being one individual and strong. And we quote Churchill and we look at strong examples. But it's fascinating when you take that away and you devolve things and you say, so you are losing something, but you're also hugely mitigating risk.
This is too big for any one of us, basically. It's something we're all going to have a stake in. And yeah, if you make it all about one individual, like Greta Thunberg does an incredible job, but firstly, it's too much for one person to carry. It's too much. It's not fair what she's having to carry. And secondly, if they slip up, and we all slip up, you can then pile in and discredit the whole thing. So yeah, I think it's about giving everyone a voice, actually, and giving everyone agency.
And I think it's interesting at a time when people are feeling disillusioned with politics and excluded and not having a voice. I think it's interesting as well, the dynamic that you're promoting there, which is this, it's a genuine democratic sense behind what you're doing, in that you, as you say, you want everything. And that flows against the existing structures that we have in place. So in many respects, I look at you don't necessarily want to stray in these things, but you very quickly get to a point where the more successful you are, the more you're putting into relief. For example, I don't know, just take the electoral system that we have here in the UK as an example that is clearly not very representative. And I think it's fascinating the other things that you are unleashing at the same time, the questions that you might, back to my point around meetings, is I think you are unleashing a whole host of other questions. Why do we do it this way? And one of the interesting things, I think, and maybe this is one of the fears that people have, is that if you start to look and say, well, do we really need to fly as much as we are? Do we need to fly at all? What else might they unpick? And that's a really, it's very liberating for the people that feel they want change. But that's part of the threat in a little bit to the people that sort of, they might be happy. I agree we should do everything with the climate, but what else might he end up dismantling as he goes down this mission?
Well, Extinction Rebellion has a laser focus on climate and nature. And there are various views within the movement as to whether this is right or whether it should take on other goals too. And my view is that that's its strength, to actually just focus on climate and nature, not split its constituency. And its constituency is everyone, basically. So it would be a mistake to split it. And there are very, very pressing social problems throughout the world and problems of justice, but don't try and do everything. Let other movements address those other problems, except to the extent that they have to be addressed in solving this problem. So I'd say that. Now, just something came up about what you were saying about meetings, and I've written this reverse dictionary where you get the definition and then you get the word. And so one of the entries is the definition is where you put the people who aren't doing anything, and the word is meetings.
I love that. That's brilliant. Look, I could speak to you forever, but you have a ton of other things to do, so I'm incredibly grateful for your time. But before we go, I want to finish this in a way that one might finish it traditionally, which is sort of action points. And I'm very keen for you to put word out. So how can, let's start with the sort of the behavioral science and the compliance of people that are in the business of influencing human decision-making. How can they help if they feel stimulated by what you're saying?
The first thing would be ideas. So this is a really, really complex problem. Sherlock Holmes had something he called a 3-pipe problem, which is a problem he took 3 pipes to solve. And this is, I don't know how many pipes, this is a 1,000,000 pipe problem, possibly. So we need everyone's ideas, everyone's ingenuity, everyone's expertise. We need all the ideas we can get. It doesn't matter where they come from. We need all the understanding and sophistication we can get. And the idea that, I love the saying, I'm not sure who it was, it might have been Einstein, saying to go on doing the same thing and expect something different to happen is madness. It's
right.
Like, and that's what we're doing. And the emissions are still going up and we're still having COPs and things. And then I would add a few more things. We need legislation. So there is a bill going through the House of Commons at the moment called the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. It's got about 100 MPs backing it so far. Get on your MPs back. Don't let them not back it, basically. We need protest, and you don't have to be arrested. And it's an incredible eye-opener to come and join an Extinction Rebellion protest and see what's happening. Just come and look. It is really fascinating. We need dialogue. So talk to your children above all. See what they think about it. See what they're asking of you. There's a very emotive phrase. Someone's made posters of 2 of my children who, it happens, are in. Well, they have been in the tunnels under Euston. One of them's still there at the moment, protesting HS2, which is a massive carbon disaster, basically. And someone has made posters of them, copying the NHS posters, saying, look into my eyes and tell me you're doing everything humanly possible to solve this problem. So that kind of emotive behaviour, very important. Talking to children, very important. And children, talk to your parents. And then what else? Well, I think that's a pretty good start.
That's more than enough to be getting on with. Clearly, I will put links to relevant websites and interesting articles in the show notes. Well, so thank you firstly for everything you've done, but secondly, thank you for being a fantastic guest on the podcast.
Well, Christian, thank you for having me. It's been actually wonderful talking to you.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Roc for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Extinction Rebellion, its objectives and what it is doing, please have a look in the show notes. There's a link there to website and other resources. If you've got any ideas that you want me to share with Roc about how he can further his objectives and persuade people to change their behaviour, please do let me know and I'll happily share them with him. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the platforms. If you're interested in the broader topic of human risk and how I can help you to solve problems within your own organization, have a look at human-risk.com. There are resources and links to all of my services there. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, please stay safe. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you very soon for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.